In 2001, journalist Nick Turse was researching post-traumatic stress disorder among Vietnam veterans when he came across a folder labeled Vietnam War Crimes Working Group in the U.S. National Archives. That discovery changed the course of his career. Inside were hundreds of reports, testimonies, and investigations, many classified, documenting atrocities committed by U.S. forces in Vietnam. Turse wasn't looking to uncover a scandal, but what he found led to the book Kill Anything That Moves, and its message was devastating. The massacre at My Lai was not an isolated event. It was part of a broader pattern of systematic brutality carried out under official policy. During the Vietnam War, the U.S. military's success wasn't measured by territory captured or cities secured. Instead, it was measured by one key metric: the body count. The more enemy fighters killed, the closer to victory. This sounds logical until you realize how enemy combatants were defined. According to Turse's research, the definition was often so vague that virtually any Vietnamese person could be considered a threat. As one officer said, if they run, they're VC. If they don't run, they're well-disciplined VC. This attitude turned the entire civilian population into targets. General William Westmoreland, the commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam, pushed for high kill counts. His strategy focused on attrition, grinding down the enemy through sheer numbers. But under this pressure, field commanders inflated body counts, reported civilians as enemy dead, and set incentives that made atrocities inevitable. Turse writes that officers who racked up high body counts were rewarded with promotions, medals, and press attention. Soldiers were placed in a situation where identifying the enemy was almost impossible. The Viet Cong didn't wear uniforms. They blended into villages and jungles. In response, entire regions were designated as free fire zones, areas where U.S. troops were allowed to shoot at anything that moved. And they did. In one operation, a U.S. unit claimed to have killed 128 Viet Cong. Turse found that the dead were mostly women and children, some of them killed while hiding in underground bunkers or fleeing across open fields. The book's title comes from an actual order given to soldiers before an operation. Kill anything that moves, a U.S. colonel instructed his troops. These weren't just heated words in combat, they were directives passed down the chain of command. Turse documents how these orders were not rare, but repeated across provinces over months and years. The most well-known atrocity, the My Lai Massacre, occurred in 1968 when American soldiers murdered over 500 civilians, including women, children, and the elderly. Turse emphasizes that while My Lai was horrific, it was not unique. He uncovered records of hundreds of other incidents, village burnings, rape, torture, executions that never made headlines. One veteran, medic Jamie Henry, told Turse, "I saw 5 or 6 My Lais every month." One of the most chilling aspects of Turse's research is the culture of silence and cover-up. Reports of atrocities were filed and ignored. Investigations were buried. Whistleblowers were threatened or reassigned. Turse accessed over 9,000 pages of declassified military documents detailing 320 substantiated war crimes. Only a handful of those cases resulted in any punishment. Ron Ridenhour, a soldier who helped expose My Lai, spent a year writing letters to Congress and military officials before any investigation was launched. Even then, the inquiry was limited. The message was clear: accountability was a threat to the system. Soldiers who killed civilians were often praised. Soldiers who spoke out were punished. The testimonies Turse includes in his book are often raw and disturbing. One soldier recalled being ordered to fire into a hut with children inside. Another described collecting body parts to increase the unit's kill count. One veteran confessed, "We cut off ears and made necklaces." This wasn't some deranged group acting on its own. It was how the war was conducted. In basic training, troops were often taught to dehumanize the Vietnamese. Slurs like gook and dink were used to strip civilians of their humanity. Once that line is crossed, the moral consequences disappear. Turse argues that this was not accidental, it was baked into the strategy. The war could only be fought effectively if American soldiers believed they weren't killing people, but eliminating enemies. The Vietnamese civilians had no voice in American media at the time. Most stories about the war were filtered through press briefings and official statements. Turse traveled to Vietnam to hear from survivors firsthand. In village after village, he met elderly women and men who had lost entire families. One woman showed him where U.S. soldiers threw a grenade into her house, killing her children. Another pointed to a rice field where dozens of bodies were left unburied for days. In Quang Ngai province, where My Lai occurred, civilians were subjected to repeated operations. Villages were bombed, set on fire, and bulldozed. Turse documents how civilians fled from helicopters only to be gunned down in open fields. In some cases, soldiers admitted they were never really sure who was a threat and who wasn't. They just fired. Some soldiers tried to resist. A few refused to follow orders or reported what they saw, but they were in the minority. Many more went along, believing they had no choice. Others became numb. The pressure to survive, the pressure to perform, and the emotional toll created an environment where violence became routine. The effects didn't end with the war. Many veterans returned home traumatized, suffering from guilt and PTSD. Some were haunted by the things they had done. Others couldn't talk about it at all. One veteran told Turse, "We were trained to kill, not to think." These men were not monsters. They were products of a system that valued body count over human life. Turse also draws connections between Vietnam and more recent conflicts. In Iraq and Afghanistan, civilian casualties were again underreported. Drone strikes, air raids, and special operations often resulted in collateral damage that was never fully acknowledged. Turse's point is that unless the root of these policies is confronted, history will repeat itself. The U.S. government never issued a formal apology to the people of Vietnam for the systemic violence. Some individual veterans have returned to Vietnam to express remorse, build schools, or offer reparations. But on an official level, the atrocities described in Kill Anything That Moves remain largely absent from textbooks and public memorials. Turse is careful to say that not every American soldier committed war crimes. Many served with restraint. Many were themselves victims, caught in a system they didn't create. But his argument is that the system enabled and even encouraged abuse. It wasn't just a few bad apples. It was a policy problem, a leadership failure, and a national blind spot. One of the most powerful ideas in the book is that Vietnam was not just a battlefield, it was a place where morality was constantly tested and often failed. The villages of Vietnam became killing fields not by accident, but by design. And the people who suffered the most, poor farmers, women, and children, were rarely counted in the final reports. Today, the legacy of Vietnam continues to shape U.S. military doctrine. Concepts like force protection, surgical strikes, and special operations are meant to avoid the mistakes of the past. But civilian deaths still occur. The temptation to simplify war into numbers, enemies killed, missions completed, remains. Turse's work challenges us to rethink how we remember war. It's not enough to honor the sacrifice of veterans. We also have to confront the costs of war for those who had no choice, those caught in the crossfire. Without that honesty, remembrance becomes selective, and selective memory leads to repeated mistakes. In the end, Kill Anything That Moves is not an anti-military book. It is a demand for transparency, accountability, and reflection. It asks uncomfortable questions. What happens when war becomes a numbers game? What do we lose when soldiers are trained to see through a scope rather than see a human being? For many, the Vietnam War is history. For the people Turse interviewed, it is memory. And for the next generation, it should be a lesson.